Have you guys seen that tweet about someone driving a self-driving car in a small town, and the person tweeting was like, wow, it's the biggest local dumbass? I imagine that's what Nayeon's entrance in the ABCD music video could have been like, except the people aren't stunned by the fact that she can't drive for shit. They're just stunned by a girl named Nayeon, like the logo in the beginning says. The video starts with a literal car crash, and the concept is just this girl leading people around, guiding them, and I love it. That's what a lot of the music video amounts to, at least. But the lyrics are also taking on this role of a guide. I mean, it's the ABCs. It makes sense for it to be simple and didactic because it's the root of language, and K-pop is often at its best, at its most succinct. I don't know if I want a song about, like, babbling in phonemes. Anyway. Hi, my name is Siri, and I want to talk about Nayeon's comeback because I think it's going to be my song of the year. I think it's going to be my album of the year, and I already thought this was a good year for K-pop. It's that good. I definitely appreciate that there are a lot of motifs and themes interspersed throughout the songs, which we'll definitely get to. First, we have to get to know our ABCs. ABCDs. You know what I mean. I was just talking about how it's all about the speaker acting as a guide. To expand on that a bit, I think it's very careful in its characterization, first of all. We start the song being told not to stop it, a turn of a command to no one, really, which allows us to feel very tied to the speaker. They also comment about things being in slow-mo, but we don't get the version of the song where things are in slow-mo. We are hyper aware of the absurd nature of having such separate perspectives, and the defiance of expectations really allows the speaker to establish their own pacing with their own intent. We get to see them recognize their own experience and deliver their own commentary, establishing their own viewpoint of things. And in describing their own experience, they rhyme with the word O, obviously sounding like the letter O, which is kind of different from the rest of the letter references throughout the song. O is just past the middle of the alphabet. And this allows us to settle into a feeling of non-novelty, the same way they are direct about the timeline we're in. I also think it's important that they describe things they do not have, no more, not their option. Things will later be presented in a rather straightforward manner, and I think it's also important to establish that they have options and they still choose how they do. We move into descriptions of non-physical things like desire, and we continue this path of characterization, giving the speaker goals. We get to know their inner wants and see their dialogue with others. We really have their interactions with others at their most basic, and we get to learn from them, sourcing echoic memories as the subject is told to listen, but also recognizing that love is something you can teach. They are guiding the listener through their logic and rehearsal, and they are emboldened with attention and love. There is anaphora and end rhyme, and it's about coming into fantasy and not being able to escape, so it seems fitting that the end repeats because then there is no end to that end, if that makes any sense. Also, at least in English, this part of the song is when they first use 3-syllable words. I'm not counting every time because that should be 2 words, but with these bigger words and anaphora, it feels like they are making their way up and growing. On the other hand, they use the word I, and it's because of the letter. But technically, grammatically speaking, you should use me there. The use of I implies activity, but you could say the speaker is subtextually active despite the more simple presentation. As we continue on, we get grammatically complex feminine near rhyme. Yeah. On the other hand, they describe their emotions, calling them thrilling and saying that they might lose their grip. Thrilling and gripping seem like intentional, obviously related diction in reference to things like psychological thrillers. In this way, there is some control of chaos, but they are describing chaos as losing control. They also mention talking mute, an oxymoron, and moving, and there really is no need to hold back their natural reactions. They mention something about seeing the real them, and I think that's more foreshadowing about the album tracks as a collective, since we don't delve into that too much in this song alone. They talk about feeling alive, adding dimension to their reality, and they are able to admit how their heart trembles, but they're not breaking down, instead resisting the urge to fold. As we wrap up, they start having a lot of parenthetical interruptions, and it's a fun way to culminate their thoughts while also representing their complex psyche with the language at their disposal. That's ABCD for you. Next we have butterflies, and they say to look at the fly and repeat the comment to fly, yeah, sort of alluding to the idea that seeing is believing and a confirmation of things. The first verse of the song kind of reminds me of the discussion of theories of emotional perception. There's a theory that people actually have their physiological reaction to a stimulus, and the body interprets that reaction, thus creating a sense of fear from that rather than the other way around. That sounds kind of crazy at first. I think it makes more sense to me with time. But there's also a theory that the psychological and physiological reactions happen at the same time, as the thalamus sends a message to the brain and the brain experiences emotions. I think that's a more likely explanation of things. And I think Butterflies does a good job of conveying emotions and physiology occurring together. For example, knowing they have a crush is a conclusion they come to as they contextualize the bodily feeling of a rush. They know they have chemistry as they feel the energy. I also think it's interesting there are a lot of lines without grammatical subjects followed by a line about not knowing what to do, almost like they can never really fully grasp a subject in more than one way. Speaking of their heart and it saying go, they personify what is really just a part of themselves as the greater world reacts by getting slow, like they said in ABCD. The lineation here is also interesting. There is the division of tonight and I'll rather than using a caesura and keeping them together. On the other hand, they keep cause I got fireworks inside together in the same line, making me question what is meant to be inside and what implicates the speaker almost feeling outside of themselves. The chorus plays with how direct it can be. They get no sleep, which partly because it's a noun feels closer than no sleeping, which establishes a bit more distance. They also say I keep on replaying the time. They describe themselves as having something, keeping something, to then describe their insistence to continue. We have our limitations and we have our capabilities. They also describe those kinds of butterflies, putting some distance. They describe what they claim to have never felt in vivid detail, almost as if they're in denial. They use lots of onomatopoeia and near rhyme, but it is their heart acting first, even as they convey the sheer extent of their feelings. They establish a collective identity using we, though without a predicate, really getting across how they are able to be both simple and special at once. And they say they act, think, and love more than something animalistic, which they can contrast with the perceived elegance of butterflies. They kind of play with the idea of games, throwing out a never have I ever. It takes games seriously. They elicit feelings even when talking about things the speaker hasn't done or felt. They have a lot of implications about how you should theoretically feel. The speaker kind of contrasts more cozy and intense feelings, but they also describe seeing clear weather, essentially the lack of weather, and they are portrayed more in relation to the moon than the earth, almost playing off of diverging from the narrative of a valediction forbidding mourning. Yet there's near rhyme encompassed by exact rhyme pairing off the very intimate versus what is shorter and more intense. Then we have heaven. The first verse includes a lot of I's. When they don't include an I, it's to say this relationship is so easy that it's hard to not recognize the ease. They also convey that they don't want to be with anyone else, almost taking the perspective that having someone else would mean lacking what they do have. They have a self-awareness of themselves with knowledge of expectations. They also have knowledge of a reality that doesn't not live up to expectations. They know how these things normally go, but they end the first verse with another line without an I, suggesting their knowledge of their own self-worth is almost implicit. The song also takes on a guiding energy, taking the time to emphasize what isn't good for the heart, even if it's more loving than necessarily didactic. They also portray the internal versus external experiences. When they refer to someone who feels like heaven, they don't say the who part, more enraptured by the experience. There are still a lot of internal expressions, though, even with internal rhyme. When they don't rhyme, it's words like selfish and something, these words that have undertones like they're demanding. And we return to this idea of games. Their language has consonants. It can be very tactile and evocative, and that is why it has character. And I think the way that you approach games says a lot about you, and it's interesting to not necessarily handle heaven with particular intense care, but games are important. In my opinion, that's the kind of mindset you have when you are truly blessed. That's kind of a heavy sentiment to end the analysis on, but we do have to move on to Magic. God, I love this song. Julie is my Kiss of Life bias, so what do you expect? And she does such a good job here. But anyway, they convey an interesting sense of ethos with low language, but also feminine rhyme and no grammatical subject. There is internal feminine rhyme and didactic, quote-unquote, guiding energy. There's so much feminine rhyming, even some near-end rhymes. They reference energy and feeling, like in Butterflies, and hypnotism, like in ABCD, but it's grammatically more complex here. Technically, it goes from compound complex to complex. And there's sort of an undermined simplicity with the sentiment, just like Magic, being simple but not grammatically simple, not being a fully independent clause. There's a lot going on, though. Internal feminine rhyme, near-end rhyme, lots of good material. Later on, we have more near-end rhyme and epistrophe, and it's just a very playful song, and I think it does a good job of pulling that off in an authentic way. Next is Holly Golly, and I don't know if you can tell, but I'm very white, so I had no idea what that meant. It's like a card game where you try to get a combination of fruits, from what I understand. Like I said, that this album takes games seriously. They sort of mimic the idea of shuffling with how they organize the language. When they explain the rules of the game, things are grammatically complex. They introduce the song's central metaphor in a more straightforward way, whereas there is anaphora that doesn't always lead to something in a very direct manner. With their treatment of the game aspect, they really don't feel any freedom of condemnation, the sort of pressure that free will puts on the individual. There's an interesting stipulation with the central relationship as well because of the game element's power dynamic. Something is something, a lot of specific things actually. It goes from being minimizing to hyperbolic and talking about a lot of the things we've already talked about, the idea of having something, games, chemistry. They contrast the me with the word baby and having a direct end versus almost qualifying the word baby by repeating it like it'd give it more specificity. They're demanding, not just through anaphora, but stuffed lineation. They contrast it and you stuffing in babe as a very cutesy nickname versus simply stating, I haven't fallen for you. And that is very simple, but still has the implication that they may have fallen for someone else. The second verse begins with the idea of ending, again, acting like a guide. They say you're still wandering again, using both still and again in the same line, and they ultimately relinquish responsibility for the answer, but there is still a right answer. Finally, we reach Count It. It starts with, from the moment I met you on that ordinary day, I knew I had to tell you today. Very Carly Rae Jepsen, but it really is pairing off the ordinary versus the special, weighing the two. They use similes versus the literal and similes versus the inability to describe even literally. They also establish the subject's part in things. It gets didactic, guiding, and they convey the desire to know more and deeper through numbers rather than treating them as strictly quantitative. They also establish a connection between the speaker and the subject in terms of their gait matching one another. There is humor and expectations, and they bring back references to slowness, feelings, and dizziness, as well as gravity. Overall, I think you can tell I liked this album. I hope so, but that's also about all I have, at least for now, although I might go back to her first album and try to talk about that now too, just not today. Anyway, like for Magic, subscribe for more, and maybe comment for my self-esteem. Thank you, bye. I'm left-handed, but Sana threw water on my right hand, so maybe I'll give in to the societal pressure.